Welcome to The Quantum State, a podcast exploring the latest research and innovation in quantum computing. Join us as we dive into groundbreaking breakthroughs, trends, and news shaping the quantum landscape. Quantum State. Today we have Or Sattath, Associate Professor at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, and Bolton Bailey, a PhD student in computer science at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. So thank you both for being here.
It's great to be here.
Thank you.
So, Or, broadly, what kind of research do you do as a theoretical computer scientist? And can you tell us how you got involved in topics like quantum money and quantum blockchain?
Sure. So I was working on many aspects, actually, of quantum computing, quantum algorithms, quantum complexity. And at some point, I was, I guess at the beginning, I looked at quantum cryptography and said, well, this is too hard for me. I find it just notoriously hard to kind of figure out all the perspectives and all possible attacks. And I find it even too confusing. But, it took me some time. But eventually I got used to it, I guess, and to like it to some extent, and started working more and more on aspects related to quantum cryptography. And one of the, in some ways, like the old topics in quantum cryptography involve tasks related to quantum money. And I started to think about those. And I guess even at the time when I started studying it, I heard this new kid in the block called Bitcoin. And at the time, I didn't understand much. I think it was pretty early on, and there were very few people that I could talk to and understand all the details.
Do you remember what year it was or what price?
Oh, the first time I've heard of it, or yes. I think it was 2010.
Oh wow,
$1.
Very early.
Yeah, I think I've heard of it pretty early. I guess it's kind of interesting that, one of the most interesting money papers that was released was roughly at the same time. One was by Scott Aronson called, I don't remember the exact name, but maybe you remember the name?
Quantum money from hidden subspaces, that paper.
No. Even earlier? He has where he introduced quantum copy protection as well. And there was another paper later, about quantum money from knots. Like the original paper was by Scott Aronson, and the later paper was by a bunch of other people from MIT, including Peter Shor and Ed Farhi and many others. And I read about it. And actually, it was at the time I was a TA, and I kind of taught this topic to some groups. And I told them, well, maybe it was worth looking at this thing called Bitcoin. And again, I didn't know much about it. But again, as time evolved, I learned more and more. I think one of the first kind of talks I've heard of it was by Adi Shamir, who gave a talk about privacy aspects related to Bitcoin. And I kind of kept it at the back of my head. I guess there were I guess it's worth mentioning other people. Like I talked quite a bit with Aviv Zohar, who was at the Hebrew University at the time, and that was his main interest. So at that point, I definitely understood all the details, and I had some, a real expert to talk about it whenever I wanted, as much as I wanted. He was very open, and I liked talking about it, and was very interested in broad aspects, including aspects related to how quantum cryptography or even quantum attacks could break it, and such. And I learned a lot from him. Some point we also co-authored a paper about aspects related to mining fees in Bitcoin. And again, I wouldn't say this is like the main topic that I'm interested in. It's kind of a sidekick of mine. I'm doing mostly aspects related to unclonable cryptography more broadly, and quantum cryptography more broadly. But this is definitely something I'm interested in.
Great. So, Bolton, what are you working on for your PhD, and how did you end up collaborating with Or?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's sort of funny. The main topic of my PhD thesis is on sort of the intersection between formal methods and cryptography. So my research mainly focuses on how we can use sort of computer theorem checking systems to prove that certain cryptographic constructions are secure and correct. But at various points during my PhD, it wasn't. I didn't really have much of a connection to quantum cryptography from anything that I did during my PhD. It was more something that quantum cryptography was something that I really only first learned about when I was in undergrad, and then it was only many years later that when I was doing work on sort of blockchains that I came to think that there might be some interesting connections there. And I think I had read at that point one of Orr's papers on sort of various ways, as he mentioned, like unclonable cryptography, ways that certain things that can be done with quantum computers, but can't be done with classical computers could potentially be helpful for cryptography. And so I think at some point my advisor introduced me to Orr, and we had some meetings talking about various things, and that was basically how I got to know Orr and how I got to be working on quantum cryptography.
Great. So you both recently published an archive preprint with the title 51% attack via difficulty increase. Launching into some of the details about that paper, or can you just give us a brief primer on blockchain and how quantum computers disrupt blockchain, or potentially could?
Sure. So blockchains are a way to record transactions in a distributed manner. So two people can transact without any third party being able to, say, censor them or, say, give some conditions on how they transact, etc. So I guess the main feature here is censorship resistant. Now, the way quantum computing interacts with blockchains is kind of a bit complicated. Blockchains use two main mechanisms in terms of their cryptographic techniques that are involved. One of them is digital signatures, and the other is proof of work. I won't explain how Bitcoin works at any level. I guess there are other fantastic videos about it. I think there are many resources that one could find about that. But I guess the way that quantum computing interferes is in both of these things. So the one which is more well known is related to digital signatures, prone to Shor's algorithm or variants of it. And in particular, what that means is that if you have the public key of another party and you have a quantum computer, then you can efficiently find the private key. And therefore, you could efficiently forge and sign any message you like using that private key. What that essentially means is that if your public key is recorded on the blockchain, then a quantum adversary could basically steal all your money. Unless, of course, some precautions are made and some migration to other types of digital signatures is used. One of the main ways to do that is to use something which is called post-quantum digital signatures. What that means is that this is still a digital signature, meaning you have a public key and private key, and you can sign messages so that others cannot sign messages on your behalf. But now even quantum adversaries, ones which have quantum computers, cannot break your digital signatures. Now, this is an active area of research, post-quantum signatures. Recently, there was a NIST standardization process for digital signatures, and now we have pretty good candidates for that. And hopefully one day, blockchains such as Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others would transition to post-quantum signatures, and everyone's money would be safe and sound. So that's one aspect which is pretty well understood, both the problems and the possible solutions. The other mechanism is called proof of work. What is proof of work? Proof of work is basically a puzzle, which is in the form of finding hashes which are small than some difficulty level. More precisely, we use something such as a hash function, such as SHA-256, which is a function which looks like a random function. So it behaves like a random function in the sense that if you apply an x and like a hash 2x, it looks pretty random. Now, in Bitcoin, the way that this is used is that whenever you want to post a block, the miners try to hash header, such that the hash of the header is a relatively low number, right? And finding such headers is extremely difficult task. Now, quantum computers are only moderately better in finding these solutions. So what exactly do I mean? For a classical miner to find such a hash or to solve this proof of work, the strategy is pretty simple. He tries and tries over and over until a hash is found. So you should think of it as a lottery ticket. Now, one of the interesting aspects of quantum algorithms is called Grover's algorithm, which allows you to find such a solution to a problem quadratically faster. So the way you should think of it is if you have one needle in a haystack of size n, then the number of times that you need to try until you find the needle is roughly n. Whereas in a quantum computer, if you have one needle, it takes you only square root of n to find such a needle. And therefore, it means that it is moderately easier to find it for a quantum computer. Now, the common belief was that this isn't such a big deal in the sense that if quantum computers would, be realized at some point in the future, what this would essentially mean is that the difficulty would go higher. So already, Bitcoin is designed in such a way that a block is found every 10 minutes, an expectation. Time it took to find such blocks was actually a week rather than 2 weeks. Then the difficulty increases by 2. So it's harder to find these blocks, and therefore in the next 2 weeks, which is called an epoch, it would be adjusted so that blocks are mined every 10 minutes as they were supposed to. So the common belief was that if quantum miners arrive, then the only difference that would happen is that the difficulty would increase. And okay, that's not such a big deal. We already seen that difficulty increases many times in the past. When ASICs first appeared, then of course such a difficulty already happened, and no big deal. It was very simple, and in some sense, Bitcoin is designed to take that into account. But I guess this isn't the full picture. And it took a while to figure out. And actually, there are several aspects that are not even understood today. One is when we talk about multiple miners, right? When all the miners use quantum hardware. I can discuss that later if you wish. And the one which was done recently by Bolton and myself was about what happens even if there's a single quantum miner. So Bolton, would you like to take it from here?
Yeah, sure. So I guess to begin to explain exactly what happens in this sort of attack that we described, I guess as Or mentioned, the way that a blockchain network like Bitcoin functions is that there's supposed to be a block on average every 10 minutes or so. And the way that the network keeps that 10-minute average rate sort of constant over time, even as more and more computers join the network and more hashing power is applied to solve the mining problems, is that there's this mechanism which is called the difficulty adjustment mechanism. So the way that this works is every 2016 blocks, what is done is that the network as a whole will take a look over the past 2016 blocks, and they'll take a look at what the timestamps of the first block in that period was and the timestamp of the last block in the period was. And they'll use this difference in timestamps to get a sense of how long it took for the network as a whole to solve all of the blocks that came along in that epoch, right? This 2-week period is called a difficulty adjustment epoch, this period of 2016 blocks. And so if the blocks in the epoch come along at a very fast rate, faster than the network expects, what the network infers is that there's actually probably more hash power contributing hashes to the network trying to solve problems than it expected. And if it determines this, what it will do, increase the difficulty for the next 2016 blocks so that again, blocks will come more slowly. So we have the network. It increases the difficulty when things are going too fast, and it decreases the difficulty when things are going too slow. But the upshot of this is that someone who is trying to attack the network by making a separate chain of blocks, which is completely independent of the rest of the network, what they can do is they can sort of modify the timestamps that they put in the blocks that they make, sort of manipulate this difficulty adjustment mechanism into changing the difficulty to be essentially whatever they want. And so it's possible for an attacker to either increase or decrease the difficulty basically at will, just as long as they can mine the blocks that are needed to do this. And so in the case of a world where all of the miners are using classical computers, this is a totally workable thing, and everything is fine. Because even if an attacker does this, even if they are adjusting the difficulty to be either higher or lower, it turns out that an attacker can't really gain an advantage from this. Because what the network uses to determine what one true block is the be-all and end-all, the true sort of chain tip that is considered to be the real state of the Bitcoin network, they make that decision based on the total number of hashes that were expected to have been required to produce the entire chain up into a certain point. And so even if an attacker with less hash power than the rest of the network does sort of play with the difficulty in this way, they can't really gain an advantage because they only have a certain amount of hash power. They only have a certain number of computers that are capable of contributing blocks to the Bitcoin network. And if this hash power is less than the rest of the network, whatever alternate chain they produce is not going to have that property of having the most apparent work on that chain. So everything turns out to be fine in the case of a classical network. But the problem comes when we combine this with the quantum computers and this Grover sort of mining strategy that were outlined. So with Grover's algorithm, it's possible to spend only the square root of a certain number of hashes in order to produce a block, as would typically be the case for a classical miner. And what this means is that if a quantum miner goes and increases the difficulty of a block, well, if I as a quantum miner go and quadruple the difficulty of the block, I am now going to be each block that I mine will now count for 4 times as much as it would beforehand. But because I'm using Grover's algorithm, it will only take twice as much work for me to mine that block, because every multiplicative factor I add onto the difficulty, I only take the square root of that when I'm using Grover's algorithm. And it's only a ×2 increase in the amount of work that I have to do. And so what ends up being the case is a quantum miner can just double and quadruple again and again the difficulty of the network until they really have a large amount of ability to produce apparent hash power. And this can basically trick the whole network into thinking that a large amount of work has been done on the chain that has been mined by this sort of dishonest quantum miner. And that's basically how the attack works.
Is that distinct in any way from if we draw a black box around the Grover node that's doing this? Ultimately, the input-output of that box is hashes are coming out. That's all there is. So is this distinct from drawing a black box around just an increased number of classical nodes to achieve the same objective? Could a secret mining rig with a lot of power do the same thing?
Well, I would say that it's a little bit different for the sort of quantum black box because of this because of the Grover sort of advantage. You could draw a black box around a certain number of classical miners, and they would have the ability to output a certain number of blocks. But the difference with the quantum miner that has the sort of black box drawn around it is that as the difficulty increases, a quantum miner seems to be able to produce more and more hashes. Whereas the set of classical miners, as the difficulty increases, the number of hashes that they produce per second really just remains the same. And so for that reason, the situation with the quantum miner is a little bit incomparable to the classical miner. It's even sort of hard to say what precisely we mean by the actual hash power of the quantum miner. In the classical context, we can just say, okay, how many hashes can this one computer produce per second? But with quantum miners, it's not exactly clear what that means, because with a quantum miner, the number of hashes per second that it can produce really has more to do with the difficulty. And so it's sort of a completely different regime.
So can both of you talk a little bit about, I just want to break down again also for our audience. So how serious is this, right? Like, we talk about 51% attacks a lot in the form of transactions, and that's obviously very serious here. But, in the history of blockchain, you used to be able to mine Bitcoin with just your laptop back in the day, right? And then you moved over to GPUs where you could only mine if you had the GPUs. And now the individual who has the GPUs, they don't even have that power anymore. It's these big kind of rigs that you need to be able to even have a chance in this space. So how is this different from kind of that shift, the transition we've seen before? And how would you rank that seriousness? Obviously, like, Shor's algorithm, we talked a little bit about the transactions. And if it's that serious, is there a mitigation that we want to do, or is it kind of just, this is a consequence of new computing power coming in, this is what is going to happen to the blockchain?
So I mean, I can sort of, I guess I can sort of address that question. It's definitely the case that, like, that is sort of an important question, how much actual hash power, the rest of the network has, because I guess, this is maybe more of a question for quantum experimentalists like you all, but it's not totally certain from our point of view, like, what actually will be the capabilities of, fully fault tolerant quantum computers, even when they come out, right? It's sort of a critical question. You can build a quantum computer that's maybe in principle capable of carrying out any quantum algorithm, but what will actually the clock speed of that quantum computer be? And if the clock speed is very, very slow, then in principle you can use that to carry out our attack, but it may in practice take a long time to do that. In the sort of worst case scenario, if your quantum computer is only capable of producing blocks at a rate of like 1/10 the rest of the network, it could take hundreds or tens of thousands of weeks to sort of complete this attack. So it's definitely the case that it's sort of a critically important question. What will actually be the performance of the quantum computers themselves, and what will their clock speed be? So we've sort of gone from CPUs to GPUs to ASICs in the classical world. I guess you could sort of speculate or imagine that something similar might happen with quantum computers as well over the next decades. But I guess that's more of a question for like multiple decades, rather than just asking, what is going to be like to see the first sort of quantum computer that we have that could do this sort of thing.
So I want to add a few kind of points. So first of all, I want to be very clear about it. This is not a short-term, or I would even say medium-term threat. This is a long-term problem. It's going to take years or probably even decades to be relevant. So there's definitely no need to panic. I guess we could say a few words about the complexity of the attack here. So if the miner, suppose the quantum miner can create blocks, say, every 100 minutes, right? So that means he has some sort of so by using Grover's algorithm, this quantum miner can produce blocks every 100 minutes. So he has something which is kind of very similar to 10% of the total hashing power. Although recall that it doesn't exactly mean that, because when we use Grover's algorithm, you don't just count hashes. This is different than the classical setting. So we call that parameter R. Okay, so in this case, R equals 10. The complexity of the attack is 1 over R squared, where the 1 over r squared epochs. R is 10%. This means 100 epochs, meaning 200 weeks. Okay, and I'm ignoring constants here. Okay, so notice this is a really long-term attack. Okay, it takes years to actually implement in practice. And in particular, it also means that your quantum computer needs to operate coherently for very long periods of time. Now, quantum computers, usually you could break if you want to use a quantum algorithm on a modern quantum hardware, it would probably take you a millisecond or so. So our hardware is even designed to be able to do these, to operate for a fairly short amount of time. At this point in time, it seems almost science fiction to have a computer working in a coherent manner, meaning without errors, etc., by using error correction, etc., operating for months. And this is what you actually need for this attack to work. So I would put it at the very far end of the spectrum in terms of the hardware that you need in order to apply this attack. On the other hand, I think it's as I mentioned, we have a pretty decent plan in terms of how to deal with the problems that quantum computers create for digital signatures, for example, right? We need to find a migration plan towards post-quantum digital signatures. We have pretty good ideas regarding how to do that. Now, as for quantum miners, even though it's such a long-term threat, etc., I don't think we have a pretty good understanding of the horizon. How could we fix it? How serious it is, etc., etc. This is a little bit too. There are very, very few works about it that kind of discussed quantum mining in general. Definitely when we talk about mitigations, and as you were kind of pointing out, Anastasia, there were a few works about it. Actually, I think, I'm not sure, right? Gavin and Peter, right? You were on that paper, right? That proposed momentum as an alternative type of proof of work.
Oh, this is the boson sampling one, yeah. Where we get
no, not the boson sampling, the previous one, the momentum that has like.
I don't think I was on that
this
one.
This was the. Okay.
I don't think momentum was initially proposed by them, but they certainly analyzed the question of sort of quantum capabilities for a variety of systems in that paper, including the momentum system.
Okay. So I guess there are very few works discussing quantum mining and the aspects of it, and we do know quite a bit. We do know that for example, the Bitcoin protocol has to be adapted so that there aren't too many forks. Because if quantum miners are mining, if say all the network switches to quantum mining, then behavior of the quantum miners would behave differently than classical miners. In the following sense, suppose Bolton is mining now, and I hear about Bolton's block. Okay. The honest protocol says that I should switch and mine on top of Bolton's block. But suppose now both Bolton and I are mining using quantum hardware. So Bolton mined using Grover's algorithm, and that essentially means he applied many Grover iterations and measured his state. And suppose he was lucky and he told me about it. What should I do? Now, I already spent some time applying Grover's iterations. So again, Grover's algorithm works by applying many consecutive steps, but it's kind of important not to destroy that state, but only at the time that you want. So suppose Bolton mined for say 15 minutes, and now I come and hear about Bolton's block. What should I do? So actually, it's not so clear what should I do. But one thing to do is definitely not to just throw that thing away that I worked on and mine on top and just switch to Bolton's fork, but rather I'll measure and hope for the best, meaning I'll stop my computation at the time that I hear that Bolton successfully mined his block. And this is a very different behavior than what happens classically. You see, because when we're mining classically, There's nothing so special that happens when Bolton successfully mines a block. Everyone's, hear about it and switches. Whereas in the quantum setting, we already spent a lot of time working really hard, right? And we won't just throw it away. We'll probably all try to measure at the time that Bolton successfully mined. And maybe some of the other quantum miners would successfully do so. And therefore, the probability of having forks could increase dramatically, unless modifications are made so that this won't happen. So that, I guess, the point is that unless modifications are made, the quantum mining would already be a threat when we have quantum miners. We'll have to switch. And the way that one way to kind of deal with it is to change the tie-breaking rule. So when if there are forks on the network and you hear about two different blocks that are competing, what do you do? So the honest the Bitcoin standard rule is to mine on top of the one you've heard first, or maybe even just one mine on top of a random one. It doesn't really matter which strategy is used. Like both of them would work to some extent. But if quantum miners if quantum mining would start, then we have to use a different tie-breaking rule so that Bolton's block would win rather than mine in some sense. So again, suppose Bolton found a successful block. Now, in some sense, the cheating strategy for me is to mine if I hear of Bolton's block. And we want to rule this out. So to get around this problem, we could change the tie-breaking rule so that miners would mine on top of blocks that are closer. So again, if Bolton mined the block, and suppose he mined it at 7 p.m., okay? Now we could look, like all the other guys on the network would hear about Bolton's block at 7 p.m. And Bolton actually wanted to mine a block at 7 p.m., whereas I was planning to mine my block at, say, 7:05 p.m. So the timestamp on my block couldn't be adjusted, right? I need to decide in advance what would be my timestamp. So if we change the tie-breaking rule to be something of the sort of mine on top of the block in which the timestamp is very close to the time it was actually propagated to the network. I'm not being very accurate here, but this is the kind of intuition for what's going on here. So we need to change to that type of rule that kind of takes into account the time that it was propagated to the network and the timestamp in that block. And that would essentially give Bolton a very, very high score, whereas if I managed to find the block by mining at the time that I didn't plan to, I would essentially receive a penalty, and therefore the others won't mine on my block and rather would stay on Bolton's block, which is what we actually want. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that we already knew that there are some modifications that need to be made in order for Bitcoin to be secure in the quantum setting, which isn't necessary at all in the classical setting. And this attack that was just Bolton described essentially means that we need, there are even worse problems in some sense. And it's I don't know of what I would call a fix to that problem. Right? There are some ways to kind of make it a little bit harder or, make it better. But I'm not sure if you could completely rule this attack out. Should I get into the question of like what types of mitigations can we think of, or none of them are very, Yeah,
that's interesting. Do you want where to answer? I can relay the question, or so the question he asked was: people have come up with this sort of condition of progress freeness, which is sort of considered an important question for important that we have progress freeness in order to sort of results in Nakamoto consensus to hold. And what he suggests is that there's work, which I guess I haven't heard about, but work about using random beacons in order to sort of interrupt the Grover mining process, so that you have to use some sort of data from a random beacon and include that in order for your block to be considered valid. I think that's sort of an interesting idea. I mean, as you say, Gavin, that would sort of require like sort of, trust in the random beacon. It would require some sort of cryptographic guarantee that you have a random beacon that is, truly unbiased full randomness, that no one can cheat or affect in that way. But I think that, like, if that could be done, and if you could impose it such that, the hashes that were being done at any given time had to include that randomness, I think that actually probably would go a long way to mitigating this sort of attack, because it really is sort of critical in our attack that the quantum miner is able to mine it uninterrupted for a long period of time on one particular block. Because that's very critical for our attack, because it really confers on you the advantage of being able to get the full sort of quadratic advantage of the Grover's algorithm. And so if you could interrupt that with some sort of random beacon, that's a sort of very appealing way of carrying out a mitigation. Or if you want to, like, further opine.
Yeah, I'm not sure if so of course there are many or there might be potential holes in this argument. Bolton suggested it's kind of clear that you, to the very minimum, you need trust in that beacon. But even more, I'm not sure if even I can understand how exactly it works. Would you say that the beacon produces a number every minute or so? So you need to include 10 numbers in your block. How exactly would it operate, and how would it rule out the attack? Because Bolton, like, we could also just wait for a few minutes so that there are enough things to add to our block. And I guess one of the properties that are kind of important in Bitcoin is that for an outsider doesn't need to be online, right? An outsider could just join the network in a very later stage, and it would look everything like the history was fine. So I'm not even sure if how would even if you had a trusted beacon, how exactly would you use it, and how would it rule out the attack?
Yeah. Okay. So he said, perceiving a new problem for every beacon you receive. I mean, there are technologies that I'm sort of familiar with from, more traditional blockchain research, such as like, verifiable delay functions and things like these, which sort of provide a random beacon. And perhaps I sort of see where it's going, though. I see how, if you could include those random bits within the puzzle that you were required to solve, then it would sort of, it would mitigate the attack. It would make it harder for a Grover miner to operate. But I think the sort of point is where the attack is already sort of carrying out this sort of timestamp manipulation thing. And so it's sort of very hard for the rest of the network to know after the fact that a certain block was mined at a certain time. And if a block was mined not at that time, it seems like there's the potential for, a particular miner to learn what those random bits are, and then pretends that, like, no further random bits ever came along, and just sort of proceed under the assumption that I'm mining these particular random bits, so that it would look after the fact like the block was mined much earlier than it was. One sort of effect of our attack, which I think we haven't gotten into so much, is that because the attacker is doing all this manipulation of the timestamps, there is a significant portion of the attack where all of the blocks that the attacker seems to be constructing are actually, they're actually very far in the past in terms of the timestamps that they display relative to the actual current true wall clock time. And so this is, like, you could say that this is actually sort of a slight problem with the first version of our attack. We also discuss in our preprint sort of iterations on the attack that allow you to sort of undo this problem. Different iterations where you can sort of undo this sort of gap between the timestamp of the attack blocks and the timestamp of the real true time by adding an additional stage where you mine later at a very low difficulty. So first you mine at a very high difficulty to gain some advantage in terms of the proof of work, and then you mine at a low difficulty to gain an advantage in terms of the timestamp. So it's definitely the case that playing with the timestamp allows you to do lots of sort of wild and crazy things, maybe about sort of pretending that a certain input to the blockchain was or was not some value. So it's an interesting idea, certainly.
Or you identified some vulnerabilities to the blockchain posed by quantum computing, mentioning both your Grover-based attack and also Shor's algorithm. Do you think the blockchain community is taking these things seriously enough? A while back, I did some work with economists looking at, well, based on a forward pricing model, is the market actually accommodating for these things in the way that in traditional finance you would when you've got some prediction about future changes? What's your impression of that?
That's a tough one. It's very hard for me to tell. I don't think, I'm not sure I could give let me put it this way. So first of all, I definitely have the feeling that few people are interested in that. I didn't find too much interest by the community at large in these topics, but maybe I'm wrong here. I'm not so sure. I guess another point is, wait, let me think about it for a second.
Well, one thing I know I'm talking to folks on Twitter or X now, right? And it's a very interesting situation where a lot of people in the crypto community are getting their information from Wikipedia. So they're saying things like, the biggest number that's ever been cracked by Shor's algorithm is 15. And that's what they base their truth on, which we know that's not accurate, right? And so it's a very interesting discussion where I'm hearing a lot of this blockchain community just going, oh, well, once Satoshi's coins are stolen, then we'll just upgrade and figure it out. And that to me is that's a game I wouldn't want to play with my Bitcoin. But I'm very surprised that, Bitcoin specifically is very much adamant about not upgrading until they see certain attacks happening. I don't know if you've seen that as well, Gavin, Peter, anyone.
I haven't observed that, but now, despite having said what I said about like a forward pricing model, if you know that something's going to be bust down the line, in principle, it shouldn't be worth anything now. The other thing to keep in mind is what's the average time span over which people maintain a Bitcoin? If people are holding onto it as a short-term asset, then who cares, right? But if it's a long-term investment, like people say digital gold, then that's a different story.
But I definitely don't think that it's unsolvable. Okay, that's at least from my perspective, that's too strong a statement. It would be a long-term threat, both Shor's algorithm and aspects related to quantum mining, but that's kind of a long-term issue. I guess another kind of interesting aspect is, for example, I tried to kind of edit the Bitcoin wiki and miserably failed. I just couldn't get permission to edit it. Now, this is kind of embarrassing, right? I mean, and look, if you kind of read what's going on there, it's simply false. Many aspects there are simply false. And I guess many people try to get edit access to that wiki and simply fail. So in some sense, there are some at least systematic problems in that system. Now, I don't want to, I'm sure it's pretty hard to maintain in that sense. Like maintaining that wiki is probably pretty hard. But I did honestly try to get edit access. I went on IRC. I tried to say, well, I'm serious here, and just couldn't get it.
Are there any examples of statements that you've seen that are very false? I'd love to hear them.
Wow, it was a while back. I don't remember the exacts, but definitely, for example, the fact that even now, I'm pretty sure that aspects related to quantum mining are that's not. And look, I'm not even saying that as this isn't only the. I guess one way to fix it is to fix the wiki, and then it would propagate, right? This is probably would be a good start in this. But if you look at the entire network, the only thing you'd see is that quantum mining is not a problem. Maybe okay, yeah. Fixing switching to post quantum signatures is indeed a big deal. But quantum mining is. I didn't see any resource on the internet explaining the vulnerabilities to quantum mining. And this is something that should be fixed at one point at least in time. Yeah. So now whether how serious it is and whether how should it affect the value? honestly, I'm not sure if I'm the right person to ask. This is too hard for me.
Maybe another way of thinking about it is to whoever owns such a quantum computer, is it worth doing this on a cost-benefit basis? A quantum computer is going to be quite expensive. Is there going to be positive return in playing this kind of game?
Sure. So that's definitely, yeah. And that's something that people often miss, right? What's the advantage? So I guess the most obvious advantage is simply to short Bitcoin. I'm pretty sure that if a double spending attack would happen, the price would simply crash. If you start stealing all of, if you start doing a funky business and people realize that the system is insecure, it's like a run to the bank, right? And that's the right thing to do. When you see such an attack, the right thing to do is to take your money, and run in some sense, right? To put it in an exchange. Hopefully the exchange would receive your Bitcoins at that point, switch to dollars, and never look back. So I'm pretty sure that if an attack, a 51% attack happens, for whatever reason, by the way, that's a good motivation for whether it's a quantum computer or for any other reason. I'm sure you could make many hundreds of millions of dollars to the very least by shorting the Bitcoin price. So I think that the incentives are kind of, this is at least one way from getting lots of money from it. Another is simply, to double spend. So I don't think there's any, that's not the weak spot of the attack. There's ample of financial motivation for doing it, despite the enormous cost of developing such a quantum computer. That's at least how I look at it. I'm not sure what would be the legal ramifications of it. Maybe you would say that this could be a legal risk. I'm not even sure if that would be a legal risk, to short Bitcoin at that point and you're just making money from that. Yeah, but I'm not a legal expert. I don't know.
I have a feeling the regulators aren't going to quite keep up with this particular issue. They're a bit slow.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. For me, it seems like a legitimate attack in the sense that it's very hard to pinpoint what was this. In some sense, the model is supposed to take that into account, that the miners are not supposed to be trusted. It's legitimate to use your mining hardware however you see fit. If you had 51% of the hashing power, buying enough hardware, I'm not sure if it would be illegal to double spend. So I'm not sure if the legal consequences are major, or that's the biggest risk here. And of course, there are even parties who would be willing to take such risks. Such legal risks, right? So I wouldn't want to bet that there isn't a way to make money from such an attack. So yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it really it's a weird time right now, right? There was who's the guy that just went to jail for a while, but basically one of his points was, one of the defense was, well, it's allowed by the smart contract, it's allowed by the code, that means it's allowed by the system. And the regulators were like, no, that's like, it's still fraud in the end, like you still did a bad thing, right? So I think it also depends a little bit on the community and how they perceive this. Is like, is the code just whatever the code can do, we can do it, or are the regulators going to kind of win this battle and go like, no, this can't happen? Is it going to be considered a monopoly at some point, right? I think monopoly in the US is defined as, I don't know what percent market share, 60-70% market share on the monopoly side. Are they going to say like 51% on any cryptocurrency, like market share is a monopoly and you cannot do that anymore? So it's a very interesting time to see how that would affect kind of the long-term attack vectors, and whether people will be discouraged from doing that or there'll be more encouragement to upgrade and over time.
Sure. Let me put it in another way. One way to view Bitcoin, at least classically, is that the security model is that there is an honest majority, and the point here is that if you have a small quantum miner, in the sense that it has a fairly low hashing rate, the longest chain. So the way that you count whether you're a monopoly or not is very, very tricky in that regard, right? Because again, by tweaking the difficulty, you gain an unfair advantage in some sense. So I don't think that just counting how large you are makes any sense anymore. And yeah, I'm not sure how to deal with the legal questions. I'm not sure. I would say this: I don't want to count. As a cryptographer, right, one of the goals is that you're not supposed to rely on the regulators to make sure that the system is not abused. And I don't think this is definitely in the sense of post-quantum signatures, etc. There are good solutions to many of the problems that it would create. It would probably be, a very rough sea. When a quantum computer, which can break ECDSA, like the Bitcoin's digital signature scheme, would, arrive. I'm sure it's going to create a serious headache for the entire, community, etc. But it's not a dead end. And hopefully, for example, Bitcoin could realize that this is a serious problem, and, for example, switch to proof of stake. If we'll have enough experience with such a system and see that everything works, there aren't really serious downsides to it, that's might be a solution. There could be other solutions, maybe similar to the one Gavin mentioned, based on beacons, or maybe other alternative that we haven't thought of. So I'm not too pessimistic. I do hope that the community would take it. I'm not sure if I want to blame the community in some sense. I don't know.
Well, maybe that's our job to start building that community. Maybe we had a bunch more questions on the future of blockchain and quantum money, but I think one of the really interesting things as we wrap up this episode is, do you have any recommendations on the best way to foster this discussion on the topic between the communities, whether it's blog posts? Should we all go rogue on Wikipedia right now and just start getting our expertise up there to make this happen? What do you think?
Oh, by the way, it wasn't the Wikipedia, it was the Bitcoin wiki. They have their own wiki.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
I'm not sure if I have.
Sorry, Peter. I imagine they have a pretty long list of people who would like to make changes and who could get a lot out of doing so.
Sure, I guess that was why it was so hard for me to get edit rights, but to the point that I couldn't edit, right? So I'm not sure
what they were expecting is that you were taking a short position in Bitcoin and then publishing a potential attack vector. That's what they were worried about.
Yeah, I don't know. I hope that eventually there would be some. So, for example, one of the things that I tried to do, and I think was quite successful, was a workshop at Financial Cryptography, like the conference. And this was actually one of the, Bolton mentioned Andrew, he's a PhD advisor, and that's how I met Andrew, right? And for me, this was really successful, even just this getting to meet Andrew and discuss actually many aspects with him. And I did manage to find some interest in the community, but I wouldn't say that my impression was that people are, too much interested. There are very few people that got interested. And I don't know what to say. I hope this would change. I hope we won't have too big, the damages won't be enormous, and the potential is quite big. Even though I was kind of sending an optimistic message that I think it could be dealt with. If there's it could be a total and utter failure, right? It could be damages in the order of, again, hundreds of billions of dollars only to blockchains, right? Because of it. And I hope we won't get there. And I hope that people would take action before that. One of the things that was discussed, not only by maybe I should mention it, Bolton, did we discuss it, like the canaries, the quantum canaries? I don't know, Gavin, have you heard of it? Okay, so one of the problems with these issues is that it's not so clear when is it going to happen. If it's too late, it's too late, right? So what you want is something like a canary that gives you a head warning. And actually, I think implementing such a canary is really, really important. And what exactly does that mean? So you want, in some sense, a challenge that on the one hand would be worth lots and lots of millions of dollars. so that people would be incentivized to solve it rather than to steal, other people's money. So you want it to be a challenge that on the one hand is, or maybe even challenges that, are, say, 10 times easier than to break ECDSA, 5 times easier than, et cetera, so that you'd have, a warning ahead of time and you'll be able to prepare. So that's something that I really hopeful that would happen. This idea was actually posed by, give me a second, Justin Drake. And actually in another paper, we kind of used his idea to implement something. So I think this is a really powerful and useful idea. And I guess the problem is we need the money in order to fund it, which is a really serious problem. Who would contribute to that cannery, right? And I guess there are also technical challenges, right? How do we find a puzzle that on the one hand is, say, 10 times easier than breaking ECDSA? On the other hand, no one has a solution to. I don't think this is too hard to solve, but there are some technical issues to do that. Is that clear, like what I'm saying, Peter?
Yeah, yes, it is. And I gather someone's already taken the prize for 4-bit RSA based on the previous discussions. How much was that worth?
I definitely, this is something that I had mentioned or before coming on, but I definitely see the sort of synergy between this quantum canary idea and some of the ideas from the quantum cryptoeconomics paper that I think you all have covered on previous iterations of the podcast. It definitely seems like there's important connection between the ability to, make these, potentially smart contracts that allow you to get an early warning, and also the ability to, make, financial instruments that sort of hedge the risk or let people understand what the risk is. It seems like there's like a through line here which sort of connects all of these things, and maybe we could like improve the infrastructure around that. I think I agree with Or that that's sort of a very important thing in understanding how the future of quantum risks is going to go.
Yes,
and just a technical comment, Peter. Like, notice that here you wanted to create the puzzle so that no one could break the. No one knows the secret key too, right? So I'm not sure if the example that you mentioned, like the say 4 bits RSA, falls into this category. One has to be careful about how you design it so that there's like it's kind of similar to nothing up my sleeve questions, right? You want it to be a public key so that no one knows the secret key, and on the that it's kind of intermediate to solve. I hope that this makes sense.
I understand
what I'm saying.
What you mean. We need a secret public key. I wonder whether there might be a way of doing that using multi-sigs where where contributing parts come from different entities. A bit the way they construct verifiable random functions from delegated hashing.
I think you could even do something like, there's something called hash to curve, but I guess you need to have very specific curves so that you have the hash to curve, and you want the hash to curve to be, in some sense, an easier curve. You can't use the one that is, so on the one hand, we want it to be close to Bitcoin's curve. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
You want it to have similar properties to it. And the family that of curves isn't too large that Bitcoin uses. Like, there are other parameters, but there aren't too many. So on the one hand, you want it to be of a similar family, and then you want something like a hash to curve. So imagine that you take say a block and use the hash of the block as the public key. And there are some hash to curve techniques that are known, and you could use such an approach. And again, supposedly there's no way to do that by any other means, right? Because it's but again, one needs to be careful about these designs. I haven't seen any such design clearly written and explained and analyzed, etc. So there are definitely.
Sorry, go ahead. Finish the thought.
Yeah, that's it. I'm done.
So it sounds like we need to bring you guys back for a second episode where we brainstorm this more deeply. So thank you so much, Bolton and Or, for coming on the show and discussing this with us. We definitely want to have you back. So for our listeners, if you are watching this on YouTube, you can find a lot of information about the papers that we talked about in the description below. If you have any questions for us or for Bolton, or make sure to comment that below and we'll pass that on and maybe answer that in the next episode of The Quantum State. And of course, remember to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. This has been really great. Yeah.
Thank you.